Out on this very dreary and wet evening. It really means a lot to us to see you. I am Susan Juster. I am the Director of Research here at the Huntington, and it is a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Susan Amussen is a Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California Merced, and this year's Fletcher Jones Distinguished Fellow in British History and Culture. She has been a trailblazer in so many ways over her long and, need I repeat, distinguished career as a scholar. She was one of the first to direct our attention to the importance of gender in the construction of the British Empire, and she was a pioneer of the Caribbean turn in Atlantic studies. As a citizen of the Academy, she helped to create a new department and a new Humanities Institute at a brand new university when she took up her position at UC Merced, a task that required an enormous amount of administrative labor. She is justly proud of the fact that UC Merced achieved the designation of a Research 1 university, the top tier of classification for research institutions this year, less than 20 years after its founding, and due in no small part, I think, to her labors. I have long been an admirer of Susan's willingness to explore new research paths and to do the thankless work of academic administration, and it is a privilege to have her in residence with us this year. She is the author of several acclaimed books: An Ordered Society, Gender and Class in Early Modern England, published, hard to believe it, but 35 years ago, but still considered foundational for the study of gender in this period. From an interest in gender, she moved on to a study of race and violence in the colonial Caribbean. Caribbean exchanges, slavery, and the transformation of England heralded a burst of new attention to this long-neglected corner of the British colonial world. It was in the Caribbean that the English really learned to be slaveholders, and it was there that they created the monstrous institution that would forever change their world, and ours, in fact. Her methodology in all these books was truly interdisciplinary, juxtaposing literary and artistic artifacts like plays and paintings with historical documents like legal cases and plantation records. One of the real hallmarks of her scholarship is the way she bridges the worlds of literature and history. She is, as she has writes, been deeply engaged in dialogue with literary scholars and in thinking about literary texts as historical sources for her entire career. And of course, this kind of multidisciplinarity is the hallmark of our fellowship program as well. So she is in many ways an ideal distinguished fellow for us. A more recent publication showcases Susan's interest in the visual arts as well as the literary. In 2023, she collaborated with a graphic artist to produce a short graphic version of a scholarly article she had published a few years earlier, The Contradictions of Patriarchy in Early Modern England. It is a brilliant and funny way to distill into about 20 frames the complicated story of early modern men's dependence on and fear of women as scolds, witches, and sexual partners, and I think it was a blast to write. She has long had an interest in using the visual to explain history, and this evening we're going to get a glimpse of the visual culture she's currently exploring: 17th century portraits that depict black and white bodies in intriguing and disturbing proximity. Please join me in welcoming Susan Amussen.
Thank you, Sue, for that lovely introduction, and also for the amazing opportunity it is to be a research fellow at the Huntington, part of the great community of scholars you have fostered this year. My talk tonight is part of a very new project, so still somewhat speculative. But it also builds on work that I did when I was a Huntington Fellow in 2002-03. At that time, I went through the photo archive in the then art library on the top floor of the mansion, looking for paintings of people in 17th century England that included Black children. By the end of that academic year, I had identified almost 40 such paintings. I now have about 100 on my list, and I knew the name of one Black child. Since then, I have wondered about the lives of those children, and I am beginning a project to find out more about them. Tonight, I want to introduce that project by starting with two people you have probably never heard of. In this portrait, commissioned by John Verney at the time of his marriage to Mary Lawley in 1692, Peregrine Tyam, who you can see back here, who John Verney referred to as my black, is painted with Mary. While the lighting makes it difficult to see him, he's back in the back there, and there is a collar visible around his neck. Peregrine Tyam was brought to England in 1688 from the area of Africa known to the English as Guinea, from what they called the Tyam region of what is now Senegal. Peregrine, who's about 6 years old, was given to John Verney as a gift. John Verney was an assistant in the Royal Africa Company. Company factors in Africa frequently sent children back to influential company officials as a combination bribe and thank you gift. Tyam was baptized at the Verney home in Middle Claydon in Buckinghamshire in 1689, and he lived with and worked for John Verney until his death in 1707. In the painting, not only is Tyam wearing a silver collar, but it also has a lock on it. You can't quite see it, but it's here that holds the collar in place. The collar is a sign that he was John Verney's possession. He was enslaved. Mary Verney, the subject of the painting, was the second of John's 3 wives. She was the daughter of Sir Francis Lawley, who was, like John Verney, a member of the Vintners Company. John selected her as a bride. He had been looking since the death of his first wife 6 years earlier, primarily because she brought a generous dowry. John, at the same time he commissioned this portrait, he also commissioned a portrait of his eldest daughter. Mary was an older bride. She was 29 at the time of her marriage, marrying a 52-year-old widower with 4 children. At least one set of marriage negotiations he'd entered into after his first wife's death faltered on the existence of those children. Those children would have had priority for inheritance. The negotiations for his marriage to Mary focused less on the compatibility of the spouses than the financial arrangements. John thought Mary was handsome enough, and I believe wants no wit. More importantly, the marriage settlements provided a dowry of £3,000, and he settled a jointure of £400 a year on her. These are the funds that would support her should he die before her. And this was more or less the usual ratio between dowry and jointure. Her opinion of the marriage is not recorded. We have no letters from her, but she did promise to be kind to his children. In the painting, she is wearing the jewel right here that John gave her just before their wedding, a jewel which she reported to his father cost £100. She died 2 years later, having had a son who died soon after birth and pregnant with a second child. Peregrine Tyam was not unusual in 17th century in London, either in being brought as a child from Africa to be enslaved by a wealthy Englishman, or in being painted in the background of a portrait of an elite white woman. There was nothing exceptional, as far as we can tell, about Mary Lawley Verney either. She was certainly not alone among elite women in being valued primarily for her dowry. Both Peregrine Tyam and Mary Lawley were, in different ways, demonstrations of John Verney's wealth. His choice to have his wife painted, wearing an expensive jewel with his enslaved attendant, was designed to show off his importance. And while Mary is less of a possession than Peregrine, her marriage was purchased by her family's wealth, and the jewel she wears marks her in ways as another of John's possessions. So I'm interested in the ways identity was structured by power, and I want to use this painting to think about 2 systems of power, patriarchy and race, in the late 17th century. This painting is not unique. As I mentioned earlier, there are almost 100 paintings from the 17th century which include an elite white person with a black child. From 1660 to the early 1690s, almost all of these portraits are of elite white women with apparently prepubescent black boys. And from the 1670s, many of the boys are, like Tyam, wearing silver collars to mark their enslaved status. This is one of two 17th century paintings where we have an identification of both sitters, and the only one where we know anything about the child portrayed. The young Indian in this Van Dyck portrait of William Fielding, the first Earl of Denbigh, has been identified as Jack, but we know nothing else about him, and it is just assumed that he came back from India with Denbigh after Denbigh's travels there. More speculatively, it is likely that the young boy in this 1654 portrait of Prince Rupert is the child he captured as a 4-year-old on the west coast of Africa in 1652. Using a painting as a historical source is, of course, challenging. One can reasonably ask, are these children real, or are they just models? This is one reason why the portrait of Peregrine Tyam, is so important. Tyam has been identified as the sitter since the 18th century. In other cases, we know that a sitter had an enslaved person in their household, but not whether that person is the child portrayed in the portrait. We know, for instance, that Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland, one of Charles II's mistresses, had an enslaved black named Klaus, but we do not know if this is Klaus over here. 4 others of Charles's mistresses were painted at one time or another with enslaved children. The most famous of these paintings is this one, because it's in the National Portrait Gallery, of Louise de Keroualle, Duchess of Portsmouth. And we'll come back later to talk about paintings like this where the child is actually a girl and not a boy. There are interesting differences. But in some cases, a real child might be attached to a painter, not a family. The same child is in 3 portraits by William Wissing, including these 2, which are essentially the same pose, so that there was a pattern in the studio that could be used. And these are really 2 separate paintings. But even a child in a painter's studio is a child. A painting asks us to see the sitters, and it asks us to see them in a very particular way. It is not a candid snapshot caught by the paparazzi, but a staged version of themselves, rather like the holiday cards that many of us receive. It thus presents who and what we do and do not see. There are no 17th century portraits of the English elite, men or women, with black adults. Most of the children painted are boys. The paintings with girls often appear more intimate, as in these, with an arm draped around the shoulders, although it's not clear to me whether that's a controlling or affectionate gesture, or both. John Verney is absent from the portrait he commissioned, but it is speaking of his wealth. Paintings of men with enslaved Africans are almost all military or ceremonial, as in these 2. The painting of Lord Byron was just after he was injured in a skirmish in 1643, and you see in the one of Drummond, you can see that the slave is wearing a collar with a ball on it rather than a lock. It's not entirely clear why. There are no formal portraits with white servants. The paintings give the obviously incorrect impression that everyone is either very wealthy or a black child. These paintings are demonstrations of power and wealth by the person, usually a man, who commissioned them. So why should we spend time discussing two obscure people who left scant traces in the English archives? I think that the lives of Peregrine Tyam and Mary Verney can help us understand the challenges faced by patriarchy and the way it was complicated by race in late 17th century England. It was not, after all, unusual for husbands to have portraits painted of their wives, and there are scattered portraits, including black attendants, from the late 16th century onwards, reflecting both Britain's engagement in the trade in enslaved people and the presence of a growing black population in England, both enslaved and free. Yet the concentration of portraits in the late 17th century and the emergence of visible silver collars in them suggests the need to visually emphasize white authority, and particularly white authority over black men. Why do I say that? When you look at the portraits of elite women with black attendants, the women exude great wealth, but their poses are more decorative than powerful. So compare this Gilbert Sost portrait of a young woman who's, I think, picking oranges and lemons from a tree and putting them in the basket, but it's not entirely clear. She's decorative. She's not powerful. On the other hand, this portrait of probably the young Marquis of Blandford, shows him already taking up a pose of command and leadership. If you have any doubt that these portraits of women served men, look at this portrait of Nell Gwyn, Charles II's mistress, making a sausage. Yes. Between the drape of her dress and the very suggestive action of her hands, this very small painting, it's only about 9 inches by 7 inches, so it's clearly meant for close inspection, was not, unlike most of these paintings, was not meant for the public. But here she is attended in this very kind of sexy pose by a young boy with a silver collar. By 1682, when this was painted, it was said that Gwyn was the only one of Charles's mistresses who could still arouse him. So there is definitely, everything you saw in this painting is there. If you want a less suggestive painting, we can lower the temperature here. This portrait of Charles's daughter, Lady Charlotte Fitzroy, with an Indian attendant, is a reminder of Charles's global claims. So, why the need to portray relatively passive women with subordinate and often enslaved children from Africa or India? What is happening in the late 17th century to make these questions of authority and power so alive? Why would John Verney have wanted to display the enslaved African child who served him in a painting with his new wife? Patriarchy, a social system which gives some men, particularly usually heads of household, authority over women and children, has existed in some form or another in almost all known societies. It assumes the general subordination of women to men. It has proved to be remarkably resilient and adaptable. Consider, for instance, that in 1363 to 64, women's wages in England were 71% of men. The number in 2002 was 75%. It's not that nothing had changed in the interim. I'm not saying that 1363 and 2002 were the same, but patriarchy was still there. And one of my long-term interests, just so you see where this fits, is understanding how patriarchy changes and adapts to new conditions. Patriarchy was never simple. In the 17th century, the ways in which law defined patriarchal power was different from how science or religion did. Some women had power over some men by virtue of rank, age, or wealth. Not all men possessed patriarchal power. It was, in 17th century England at least, primarily the possession of married men with property. Because the household was the primary economic institution, men with property were expected to marry. In some situations, however, women not only managed households, but were expected to, when their husbands were away or when they were widowed. Patriarchy then offered some women limited but not insignificant options for power and authority. On a certain level, there were no explicit challenges to patriarchy in the late 17th century. Yet because there were slightly different understandings of women's subordination in different contexts, patriarchy was always dynamic and unstable. And the importance of the Royal African Company, which had sent Peregrine Tyam to England, and the fact that it sent black children to England to grease the wheels of its business, is a reminder of the major changes in the English economy taking place. From the late 1640s, the island of Barbados had been producing sugar, a highly profitable crop. Over the coming years, sugar production spread to other Caribbean islands. And here we can see a 1692 painting of Bridgetown Harbor in Barbados with not only ships, but a dragon? Something? Who knows? In the 1660s, planters in England's new colony of Jamaica also began to cultivate sugar. In the late 17th century, the English economy was undergoing a major transformation. So now I'm going to take a brief digression to the sugar economy. Sugar brought great wealth, particularly to the merchants in England. Its production also depended on the establishment of racial slavery as the primary organization of labor in England's Caribbean colonies. Thus, the importance of the Royal Africa Company, which held the monopoly on shipments of slaves to the colonies. The transition to the dependence on enslaved labor was rapid. Between 1640 and 1660, the number of enslaved Africans in Barbados went from less than 1,000 to about 20,000, while the number of white residents went from 9,000 to 20,000. Didn't mean to do that. Sugar is a labor-intensive crop. It takes about 14 months to mature, but canes were individually planted, then regularly weeded, and when it came time to harvest, the plantations were extremely busy. Sugar in canes begins to degrade as soon as it's cut, so there is a premium on processing the canes as quickly as possible. That process involved first crushing the canes in a mill, then slowly boiling down the juice until just before it was crystallized, then putting it in clay containers to dry out. During the sugar harvest, mills ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. It was, to use 21st century terms, just-in-time industrial process. In this print from the mid-18th century, you can see the canes being crushed in a mill, and then the juice is running from the mill down to the boiling house, and it starts in a big vat, and then as it boils down, it's moved to smaller and smaller vats. And this plan of a curing house, this from the Huntington's copy of Richard Liggon's True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados, shows the curing house. The top is where the boiled sugar would be placed, and there are holes in the bottom of each of these containers which run down into these tracks, and down here, the molasses sort of drips out as the sugar dries, and then the molasses runs through these tracks to be boiled into rum. It's a very complicated process, right? It was entirely new for the English, of course, and later on Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. The labor was highly skilled. The boilers especially were valuable workers, as the boiling process determined the purity and thus the value of the sugar that would be sold. Often, the enslaved workers would know more about the process than would newcomers who might be managing them when they came from England. It was also difficult and dangerous. Enslaved men were crushed in the mills, and falling into a boiling vat of sugar led to certain death. It's not only that the production of sugar was a complicated industrial and agricultural process. The English in the Caribbean also had to learn how to manage a labor force of enslaved workers, and this was challenging. The demands of growing and producing sugar were specific, and timing was critical. The labor force in the early years was made up almost entirely of people brought directly from Africa. While most were young adults, they were both women and men. They formed families. They had expectations of how the world worked. While those expectations were routinely challenged both by their treatment on board ship, on the Middle Passage, and on plantations, enslaved workers never ceased to have identities and goals separate from those of their enslavers. Richard Ligon, who came to Barbados in the late 1640s, observed that the enslaved men told their masters that they could not live without wives. While the English initially thought that they would only have men as workers, they had to add women to the mix. Enslaved women were then made to do backbreaking work in the fields, work that English men had not initially expected women to do. They dug the holes for the canes, weeded them, and helped cut them and bring them to the boiling house. Enslaved Africans on Caribbean plantations were seen by their English enslavers as outside patriarchal structures. They were never seen in the same way as white women and men. In 1675, William Whaley, who served as a manager of the plantation owned by William Hellyer of East Coker, Somerset, wrote back to Hellyer in Somerset. After a discussion of his need for carpenters and masons to be sent from England, he noted that we have 2 women on the plantation, the doctor's wife and the potter's, 2 filthy sows, lazy sows, good for nothing. This remark is misleading for 2 reasons. First, it neglects enslaved African women on the plantation. Second, it is highly unlikely that the 2 women really did no work. They were on a relatively new plantation in the boondocks, still being cleared at the time, and there's nobody else to do the work, so they almost certainly did the work that most women in England would have done. However, that work made no contribution to the profits of the plantation. They were good for nothing because their labor had no cash value. At the same time, the black women were not seen as women. Black men could never be seen as patriarchs. Patriarchy had always managed to place some men over others, but within plantations, no black men were given full patriarchal power. It was not just the English assumption that patriarchal power belonged to married men with property. In the slave societies of the Caribbean, the impossibility of seeing enslaved men as patriarchs fed the central anxieties of slave societies, the fear of slave rebellion. These fears were shaped by gender and sex, as was the response to them. Allied to the fears of resistance by enslaved men were increasingly sexual fears that enslaved men would rape white women. We can see this in accounts of slave insurrections or planned insurrections. A slave conspiracy in Barbados in 1676 was reported in Great News from the Barbados. It alleged that the Coromantes from the Gold Coast of Africa had chosen one of their member, Coffee, an ancient Gold Coast Negro, to be crowned in a chair of state exquisitely wrought and carved after their mode. He was to be honored with bows and arrows to be carried before him, and trumpets made of elephants' teeth and gourds to be sounded on several hills to give notice of their general rising. The slaves would then be set fire to the canes, run in and cut their masters, the planters' throats, and their respective plantations where they did belong. This was thus to be an attack on the political and economic establishment of the island. The writer was not sure whether all white people would be killed. Some affirm they intended to spare the lives of the fairest and handsomest women, their mistresses and their daughters, to be converted to their own use. But some others affirm to the contrary, and I am induced to believe that they intended to murder all the white people there, as well as men as women. Now, this parenthetical reference to a belief that the author doesn't quite share but wants to give you is a sign of things that are up in the air. There is debate. In a relatively young enslaved society, it was less than 30 years since the introduction of sugar and large-scale enslavement on the island, the fear of the people they enslaved was agreed on. There is still uncertainty about the sexual dynamics of race. Would enslaved men desire white women? Although over time, enslavers came to assume that, it was not yet agreed on. But because black women were not seen as women, you can sort of see how this process works. So, I'm going to turn back to the paintings. This discussion has taken us very far from Mary Verney and Peregrine Tyam. It is easy to assume that these concerns were only visible in the colonies, but the publication of Great News from the Barbados in London is a reminder that the concerns of the colonies were very visible in London. But this world was visible in London not only through books and pamphlets, but from reports of ship captains and plantation owners. There were particular inns and coffee houses where merchants involved in the trade to the colonies. From at least 1687, there is a Barbados coffee house in Exchange Alley, as well as a separate Jamaica coffee house. Merchants from the islands worked together to ensure government policies protected them. At the same time, in London, there was a growing population of people of African descent, both free and enslaved. Some were brought from Africa, like Peregrine Tyam, others from the English colonies in the Americas. In John Verney's household, Tyam did the same work as other servants. The only difference was that he was apparently not paid, and he was not free to leave. He carried messages to and from John, going all over London. There were apparently conflicts between Tyam and Verney. In 1699, Tyam ran away from John following an argument about his staying out drinking. Letters between John and others in the family at that moment suggest concern that he might be kidnapped and sent to the Caribbean. And before he returned, he wrote a letter to John Verney. He apologized for running away, but also noted, and I've highlighted it here, that your other servants that have not been with you half so long stay away half the day, and you say not anything to them. He's thus calling out his differential treatment. We know that he returned to the Verney household, but we do not know whether his treatment changed. Where there are lists of servants' wages, Tyam is not included. This letter shows that Tyam is literate. He had been taught to read and write. But it also shows that he had analyzed the power dynamics in the household, and he was not happy with them. Tyam was not unusual in running away. From 1660 onwards, notices regularly appeared in the London Gazette, the official newspaper, for black servants, and that's the language they use, who have run away. At least some of these servants were described in the advertisements as wearing a brass or silver collar. But the advertisements were generally posted only after someone had been gone for 2 or 3 days. For many, it may have been, as it apparently was for Tyam, part of negotiating the terms of their service. Not all people of African descent in London were enslaved or in service in a white household. The many black sailors who served on merchant and naval vessels had often been able to purchase their freedom, and some of them settled around the docks, building a life working on the wharves. Some of those who ran away from enslavers were able to retain their freedom and find other employment. Others gained freedom in other ways. Susanna Mingo was enslaved in Barbados by John Peers and bore him 3 children. They all came with the widowed Peers to London in 1686, along with 2 other enslaved women with whom Peers had had children, and their children. So Peers brings a whole household with him. His white children had already come to England, were already in England. When Peers died in 1689, Susanna and her 3 children each received bequests and lived freely in London thereafter, even though there's actually no record of manumission, but it's clear that she was treated as free. Her son Richard served in the Royal Navy during the War of Spanish Succession, where he rose to the rank of midshipman. His sister Judith eventually married a white man and had a daughter baptized in 1718. The free black population is difficult to trace, generally only visible when their race is recorded in parish registers, providing an important reminder that they're still a little bit exotic. But with a black population in England of perhaps between 5,000 and 10,000, most of them in London, the presence of black people was semi-predictable. So let's return with all this in mind to the paintings. The blacks in these paintings are all children. Whether a gift like Tyam or purchased, children were desirable. In 1683, a letter to India noted that His Majesty, Charles II, hath required of us to send to India to provide for him 1 male and 2 female blacks, but they must be dwarfs of the least size that you can procure. I want the smallest ones possible. The male to be about 17 years of age and the female about 14. We would have you, next to their littleness, to choose such as may have the best features, and to send them home upon any of our ships, giving the commanders great charge to take care of their accommodation, and in particular of the female, that she be in no way abused on the voyage by any of the seamen. That is, there be no sexual abuse. Here it is clear that age was important, but size, so that if they were older, they could look like children. They could be infantilized. These gifts sent from Africa and India served to gain favor with patrons who used the children to demonstrate their power. The men who received them enhanced their own status by controlling their household and the included black children. Similar gifts were at least occasionally sent from the colonies. African children brought to England directly from Africa were generally, like Tyam, quite young. They would arrive in a country where they knew no one, did not speak the language, and were almost always the only black children in the household, and as children were dependent. This was, let's be clear, a very traumatic event. And in some ways, I've come to think it almost doesn't matter whether or not they were enslaved, because the only family that Tyam had, insofar as he has a family, is the Verney family, right? I mean, and that's not saying anything about his relationship with them. That's what he has. In this, their situation would have been somewhat different from that of children brought from the West Indies. Those children might also have as little freedom as Tyam, and they were also removed from their families, but they would have at least had some linguistic and cultural familiarity with English people before their voyage. So why children? I keep wondering. When these grow old, partly, these children are not threatening. When they grew older, they might, like Tyam, seek better treatment. But these children who appear to be 8 to 12 years old were not seen as threats. They were not physical threats and they were not sexual threats. As they got older, they could be more problematic. Klaus, the enslaved African in the household of the Duchess of Cleveland, was threatened with shipment to the colonies should he not behave. We do not know his fate. Samuel Pepys enslaved at least 2 people, a boy and a man, and when he decided their behavior was not satisfactory, he arranged for them to be sold. The profit of the boy sold was used to buy a little good sherry and a little good chocolatey. If your image of society renders black women invisible as women and white women as singularly sexually desirable, these black children contain the potential threat to white women's chastity. There is nothing sexual about the portrait of Peregrine Tyam and Mary Verney. He is behind her offering a platter of fruit. The boys in these portraits do not touch the women they serve. In this Wissing portrait of Mary Grimston, you can sort of see he's kept separate from her. Even in the pictures with girls, as we saw, the arm encircling them is one thing, but their hands do not reach and touch the white people. These paintings record a moment of great anxiety among the English elite about their relationship with enslaved Africans, especially enslaved African men. Those men are invisible in the portraits. Instead, the portraits show constraint. Both white women and children are contained, controlled. On canvas, the relationship is not dangerous. Needless to say, paintings do not reflect reality. Enslaved Africans in London or in the colonies would continue to seek autonomy and freedom. Because patriarchy is not coherent, it is always dynamic. Reality is always more complicated than the world imagined in social systems. As the English economy depended increasingly on the extraordinary wealth from its colonial possessions, English men and women had to adapt to the ways that wealth depended on humans who were not free. Patriarchy had to adapt to this new economic reality, to find a way to incorporate racial difference into an existing system. This was not a conscious process, but we know it happened. After about 1725, portraits including collars become less common, and they've pretty much disappeared by 1750. Even the portraits with black attendants appear to become somewhat less common. The dynamics of racial patriarchy were taken for granted and no longer had to be asserted. But there are still paintings of the English elite with black attendants, enslaved or free, through the 18th century. And in several cases, we know something more about the black attendant. So let me turn to a few of those. Some years ago, I was told that the black child in this portrait of the Duchess of Montagu from about 1720 had been set up by her as a grocer when he grew up. That child has since been identified as Charles, who was a servant in the Montagu household. While I have not yet been able to confirm his running a shop, when the Duchess died in 1751, she left a generous legacy to the writer and composer Ignatius Sancho, who did set up as a grocer. So the story is certainly credible, although it is also possible, and this I will hope to find this out this summer, that the lives of Charles and Sancho have been confused. This 1739 portrait of the Burlington family, the young boy in the background here, and this one is really not very clear, he's right back here, has recently been identified as James Cumberledge. He at least at times received wages, and then from 1758 to 1778, he was employed, and employed is the actual word, as the king's trumpeter. He appears to have owned his own house in Walton-on-Thames, where a son was baptized in 1781. Finally, in this Joshua Reynolds portrait from 1783, Marcus Richard Fitzroy Thomas, a free black native of Jamaica, and he was born of free parents in Jamaica, is painted with Charles Stanhope, 3rd Earl of Harrington. Marcus Thomas's sitting is recorded in Reynolds' sitter's notebook, providing contemporary confirmation of his identity. So, let us return to Peregrine Tyam and Mary Verney. Mary Verney, as we have seen, died 2 years after her marriage. Peregrine served John until his death at the age of 25 in 1707. When he died, members of the family sent condolences to John, who they knew would miss him. This portrait, and others like it, reflect a moment of anxiety where wealthy Englishmen sought to make visible their control over both the women in their lives and the black children they enslaved. As England became increasingly wealthy through the labor of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, new versions of patriarchal ideas which incorporated race were needed. We can see the English elite working out such new ideas in the portraits in which they display and contain young enslaved children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, so I will bring the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I had no idea that there were so many paintings like this, and to see one after another is really powerful. I'm curious, you've clearly looked into as many of them as you possibly can. I'm curious if any of them show what appears to be a child of mixed-race heritage. And also, especially paintings like this, you know, the people are really blending into the background, and I was wondering how much that was purposeful on the artist's part and how much of that is the aging of the paintings.
Both of those are great questions. I haven't seen any mixed-race children. You might, you know, again, we don't know much about his family in Jamaica, so it's possible one of his parents was mixed race. In general, the art historians tell me, and so I'm going to rely on them, that there's a whole, and if you look at the tradition of these paintings going back to Titian, there's a part of the deal is the contrast between the very white skin of the woman and the very dark skin. So my sense is that the children who were painted were chosen iconographically for the aesthetic reasons, were painted with very dark skin. Whether they actually had such dark skin is a whole other question. And I think they're all in the background. My hunch is that a lot of these paintings need to be cleaned. Certainly this one does. But, you know, I mean, so some of, and I think some of them, I mean, this, you know, this one is in better shape, but, you know, it just depends. Many of them are still in private hands or have been in private hands until quite recently, so.
Is it on? Okay, it is. Thank you, Susan. I'm curious about, I just want to push you a little bit about something you said in the talk about what was different between an enslaved servant and a domestic servant of English descent. At some point you said the main difference was wages. But then in the context of the rest of your talk, you're obviously hinting at much larger differences, right? The sort of infantilization, the fact that, white servants would grow older and move into, male white servants would move into patriarchy in their own domestic situations where, enslaved servants would not. And I'm just wondering if you could think a little bit about some other kinds of distinctions that were indicated artistically. We could talk all day about other social distinctions and legal distinctions, because there are many more, but artistically, other than what you've said, it seems like there might be something to indicate these differences.
So artistically, so one of the things is that you don't see white servants in these paintings, right? And so I guess artistically, it's not, you can't really even talk about it. But so my real project, which I'm trying to figure out, is what happens when they grow up, right? And Tyam is no longer just sort of sitting in the background. He's actively doing all the same work, except he's not paid, and he can't leave. He's not really free to leave. So I think those are the effective distinctions. My hunch, and I think this is not answering your question, but I'm going to tell you what I know, which is not much. Because there are all the, so this, this is just one of those things. This is what historians do. You see something and you're like, so I'm still wondering what happens, how do they grow up? So when they grow up, many of them appear to become like coachmen, footmen. They still have household jobs, but they're a little more distant from the women in the household. So, and I think that's what I can tell from the scattered stuff I've seen in sort of contemporary books about the London elite. They have young boys as pages, and then the boys grow up and do some other things. So we can talk about this more, Brett.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much. This is actually a really apt photo for the question I wanted to ask, which is, when thinking about the gaze of the black sitter, like this one especially, the black enslaved child is really gazing upon the white woman, right? And I was wondering if you had thoughts about why they would be so locked in on the woman or the black or the white man who is the main focus, and what that might say about maybe the black child's infantilization or challenge to the white owners, and how that gaze would be incorporated into your analysis.
So one of the things the child's gaze does is it directs your eyes. So visually, you are being led to look at her, not him. And almost all of them do that. So in a sense, they increase the status of the official sitter by looking at them. I think that's that, and there's almost always an angle so that they sort of they draw your eye. So.
Thank you. This one, yes. So, and also just to add to that, the child's gaze is in total contrast to her gaze, which is entirely dismissive of him. So we have to note that also. My question had to do with the previous comment about how the children, the enslaved children, wouldn't grow up into patriarchy, but at least can you say something? about patriarchal assumptions among the African community, at least the free black community, and if there were enslaved women in some of the households, then presumably the children would grow up in the patriarchy, especially if we throw in the role of Christianizing efforts, which certainly include assumptions about patriarchy. So don't you need to think a little, maybe you certainly have, I'm sure you certainly have, about the sort of African side of things?
And this is something I am still trying to think through, but I think there is a difference in England from what happens in the colonies. And my hunch is that at least some of these boys can grow up and do marry, although as far as we can tell, most of these marriages, partly because of the sex ratio of from what we can tell, and all the evidence we have suggests a highly disproportionate sex ratio. The runaway odds are about 90% for boys and young men. And even if that's not the same as the exact population, there's clearly more male than female black people. They seem to marry into the white working class. So in a funny way, there is a black community, but there's not really a black community because they become part of the white working class. And they become invisible. It's actually, one of the things, there's one of Ignatius Sancho's descendants said, it was really remarkable to learn that I had this ancestor who was black. He'd never, it was like, it's not part of his upbringing to think of himself that way. So I think this is also part of the story of how, of race in Britain, right? How it becomes invisible, so.
Is it working? Oh, yes. Do you see a correlation, since there was a spate of these paintings at this particular time, between that these women were given, the women sitters, were given a slight elevated status with a human piece of property as opposed to a baby or a dog, because at the time there was a woman, there was a queen of England as well as a king. So there was an elevated status there of a woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. It's quite clear, for instance, that there are a whole bunch of women at the court who have enslaved African attendants. And that's partly because Charles II and James II are deeply involved in the Royal Africa Company. And so that's, and so they're getting all these gifts. And which is why all the mistresses are painted with black slaves. So, yeah, does it enhance the women's status? Sure. Although, the other thing is that the boys are kind of interchangeable with a lamb or a dog. If I were really to do all these portraits of late 17th century portraits of women, there'd also be a lot of, little dogs and lambs and things like that. So, so it's, but yes, I'm sure it's not clear what it meant to the women. And of course, is the boy theirs? Or is it the household? Right? But yeah, no, I mean, there's certainly something about status there.
Oh, okay. Is it your emphasis that is the 1600s? Did this keep going on through the 1700s? Or is this just part of the 1600s?
I need to say that the art historians are beginning to do terrific work on this. I think that there's a real concentration in the late 17th century. These paintings continue, although, as I say, rarely with the collars, through the 18th century and into the 19th century. Ed Town, who's a curator at the Yale Center for British Art, he's gone from the beginning to the mid-19th century and has about 300 paintings in his slideshow. So they keep going, but they seem to be become a little less concentrated. One of my colleagues in history argues that it's really, there's a court masque in 1674 which leads to the fashion for collars. I think that's not entirely true, but it's clear that the court is deeply into the collars, but so are other people. You know, so are quite ordinary people. That's why some of the collars are brass instead of silver. So.
Well, you can tell there's been such a lot of interest and so many questions, but let's join me in thanking you once again for this fantastic talk.
Thank you.